this is just getting started. We're in a period now where it's going to last decades. I think China has a long way to go before its power peaks. So we're in this strategic competition. There's no guarantee we'll win it, but we do have to fight it. That means we need to build a coalition of like-minded democracies. And many of those democracies so far are non-aligned, which is a concern, because the alternative that they face is that by 2121, the world could be dominated by authoritarianism and democracy could be on the ash heap of history. And frankly,
welcome to Stand Easy. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Malcolm Davis from the Australia Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, Australia. ASPI is Australia's leading strategic research institute for their Ministry of Defence, and Dr. Davis is one of their best analysts. It's a real privilege speaking with him. He's got an unbelievable view of what's taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. Dr. Davis comes with 25 years of experience with strategic studies, graduates of Australian National University, the University of Hull. He lectured war studies both at the UK Ministry of Defence University, Shrivenham, and King's College, London. A really great conversation, and I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay, well, I'm Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. That's in Canberra. At Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI for short, some people call it ASPI, but it's pronounced ASPI, is Australia's leading think tank on defence and national security issues and strategic policy. We have about 70 people in ASPI, and we cover a pretty broad remit all the way from traditional defence issues such as strategy and capability and force posture through geopolitics and alliance management into sort of things like cyber technology and cyber security and critical and emerging technologies. We've been in existence. This is our 20th anniversary this year. So we've been in since 2001 when we were first formed, and we had about, I think, 4 or 5 people in ASPI at that point. So we have grown. Our job is to provide alternative defence advice to the Australian government and also to shape the debate on Australian strategic and defence issues and national security issues, and provide sort of global and national input into that debate, as well as encouraging the next generation of future defence thinkers going forward. So ASPI is internationally recognised. All our work is read by the key thinkers in Australian strategic policy community and also overseas. So it's a great privilege to be able to work at ASPI and have been since 2016. So.
If you could you set the scene on what exactly is going on right now and your perspective at ASPI, looking north from down under, but also looking at what AUKUS and the Quad is doing for Australia and the region?
Well, it's been an extraordinary week. I mean, I think people started to get an inkling that something big was about to break late Wednesday night last week. Certainly I was all ready to head to bed with a good book, and suddenly the Twitter came alive and I thought, okay, I'm staying up late. And of course, the next day at 7 a.m., Scott Morrison, along with President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson, announced the AUKUS agreement, Australia, UK, US agreement, which is a technology sharing and strategic cooperation agreement, essentially at the highest level. The headline out of this was, of course, the decision by the US and the UK to assist Australia in getting nuclear-powered submarines. This is a huge step forward because people have been, including myself, have been advocating for nuclear submarines for Australia for quite a number of years, but the political circumstances have never been right for it. The US has basically said, no, we're not going to share that technology with you. And there's a fairly strong anti-nuclear movement in this country. So I think that what has changed over the last 18 months has been the actions of China and concerns about China in the Indo-Pacific region, and a recognition that also the deal with the French over the attack class submarines was basically foundering on the rocks. It was sort of going nowhere fast in terms of progress. It was massively over budget and massively behind schedule. And the deal had numerous gateways through which we could choose to withdraw from that deal. So, I understand France's concern and anger, but they knew that if the deal wasn't working, then we would get out, particularly when the US and the UK said, let's talk about nuclear submarines. So obviously that's a huge step forward. It's not just about the nuclear submarines, though. It's also about broader critical and emerging technology sharing. So, things have been mentioned, including quantum technology, artificial intelligence, hypersonics. I'm sure it'll cover other areas, including space, cyber, autonomous systems. So really, AUKUS is a broad technology sharing agreement, but more than that, it is a geopolitical step forward for Australia, in the sense that suddenly we are working side by side with the Americans and the British to counterbalance and deter China in every respect, and to play a leading role in the region, more so than what we've done in the past. And we were a significant player in the past. Now we're playing an even more significant role. I think AUKUS does actually sort of raise the prospect that, are we moving beyond being a middle power in some respects, which is an interesting idea. And it also opens up all sorts of doors and opportunities for the future in terms of where we take this. So the submarines are certainly the starting point. They're going to be a major component, but really it's about where we take this in the future.
So it's interesting how it's portrayed in some of the Twitter sphere or popular narratives. The focus tends to be on the submarines and the capabilities and the range. I'm wondering if you can pull it back, and you just articulated that it has much more to do with critical and emerging technologies, opening the door to the future for Australia as a more powerful player. But within your threat assessments as a security practitioner, can you open the veil for those of us that aren't in the region on what does that threat assessment look like with regards to China? And the subs are a serious deterrent, a capability deterrent. Why that nuclear sub? And if you can just sort of explore that from the Australian perspective.
Okay, well, the challenge we have is that the threat that we face from China, particularly as it relates to Taiwan and the prospect for a major power war between China and the US over Taiwan, is likely to manifest itself this decade. The problem we face, of course, is the subs, the nuclear subs won't appear until the mid-2030s. So now there is discussion, certainly right now in New York and Washington, D.C. at the Quad meeting about possibly leasing submarines this decade, so that we do actually have SSNs in the water with Australian crews in the 2020s rather than waiting until the mid-2030s. And that kind of leads to the big geopolitical and security threat that we face. The challenge is we're facing a China that is rising rapidly, that is determined to achieve the China dream, which by its definition would see China as the dominant hegemon in the region, that it ends US strategic primacy and essentially pushes the US out of the region. And part of that process is China taking Taiwan. And the concern is that this is going to happen by war or by peace sometime in this decade. And all the estimates are, or the analysis suggests, that Taiwan will not accept China's terms for unification. They don't want to go back into China, particularly after Hong Kong and particularly after Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. So, it does kind of raise the prospect that China will conduct essentially from later next year a graduated escalating campaign of coercive operations in the grey zone to try and pressure and coerce Taipei to accept China's terms. that coercive campaign will fail, and then Xi will be basically confronted with the choice, well, if he wants to take Taiwan and thus hold on to power for himself, he needs to go to war. He needs to do a cross-straits invasion. The calculus on the Chinese part is, will the US intervene in that scenario? And I think a lot of it depends on where the US is at domestically in political terms, post 2024. I think if they tried it now during the Biden administration, the US would definitely intervene. I'm not certain what happens after 2024. It will largely depend who is in the White House at that point. But let's make the assumption that the US does intervene, because the consequences of not intervening are that its credibility collapses across the entire Indo-Pacific region. If that happens, then we are facing the prospect of major power war between China and the United States in the 2020s, this decade. And so from an Australian perspective, we actually have to prepare for that possibility. I think it's highly unlikely that Australia would sit back and do nothing as the US and its key allies, including Japan, went to war with China over Taiwan. So I'm assuming that we do go to war at that point, and we have to be prepared for the consequences of that scenario. If we don't go to war, and if the US doesn't respond, that alternative world, and China takes Taiwan and by default then can impose its will on the rest of the region, then we're on our own. And so the nuclear submarines become even more important in terms of deterrence and in terms of maintaining our security.
So it's interesting that these are nuclear submarines, but they are not equipped to deal with the nuclear weapons question. That is not on the table. That has been articulated very clearly. But as Metcalf articulates in his book, that I'd like to come to in a bit, it is the super region. And if there was to be a proliferation of nuclear technologies, it would be in the Indo-Pacific. Where does the Quad, AUKUS, these subs feature within that equation? Because that is a serious question, is it not, for Australia and Canberra?
Well, I think the only way you're going to get nuclear proliferation occurring across the broader Indo-Pacific region is if the US is not there. In other words, if the US does turn away and abrogate its responsibilities to its security partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia. If that happens, then yes, all bets are off. And I think that you would very quickly see Japan move towards getting nuclear weapons. South Korea would do the same. We will be then left to consider our choices in terms of what we do. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has already indicated as part of the AUKUS package that we will not seek nuclear weapons. That's a safe promise to make at the moment, but who knows in the worst case scenario of us facing a rising and aggressive China by ourselves. I think I wouldn't necessarily hold him to that promise. But let's assume that the nukes aren't on the agenda for Australia for the foreseeable future. What we have to have is really quite powerful long-range conventional forces that can work with partners in the region. And this is where I think Metcalf's book comes in. What he's talking about is a multipolar Indo-Pacific region as a way to provide security and stability. The US is part of that, China is part of that, but really the answer lies within the Indo-Pacific region itself and the ability to work with other partners in the region, including through the Quad, so India, Japan, Indonesia, working to build up new power structures and new security arrangements so that in the worst case scenario where the US does go back to an America first type mindset, we have some sort of deterrent and insurance capability against a rising China, because if the US were to turn away from the region, which I think is extremely unlikely, but if it were to do that, then you would see Beijing, it would no holds barred. It would seek to impose its will, and it would be a Melian dialogue on a global, on a hemispheric scale.
If I can just grab one of Metcalf's quotes, it seems with AUKUS that Metcalf is sort of foreshadowing what's to come. I quote, "Some say pivotal moments in history are about leadership and initiative. Others watch for structural factors, shifts in populations, wealth, and power. But sometimes the story turns out to be one of unintended consequences, when both elements intersect. What type of intersections are we seeing right now? I mean, AUKUS is obviously a large one, but what other clouds on the horizon are you seeing with these intersections?
Well, look, obviously a Taiwan crisis will be one. I think the possibility of some sort of internal economic crisis in China would be another. And it's interesting, we've got this real estate property development, Evergrande in China, that's on the point of collapse. And people are suggesting it's a China Lehman Brothers moment. So the impact of that on the broader Chinese economy could be quite interesting to watch. But you have the potential, obviously, for a thing, black swan events like pandemics or some sort of climate change related catastrophe is another that could sort of reshape the region. I would also add in some sort of technological shock down the track, potential breakthrough on artificial intelligence or quantum technology that gives a decisive advantage to one side or the other. So, have these potential, sort of pathways rather than having a straight path from point A to point B in terms of developing the region. I think it's more a case of that pathway being intersected by a series of unexpected events. And we've already seen that, for example, with the pandemic. And I think we could see it again, depending on what happens in the US domestically after 2024. But I think Taiwan is the big factor. Is China going to make a move against Taiwan in the 2020s? How does the region respond? Metcalfe's focus on multipolarity in the region, I think, is good. But is it strong multipolarity or is it weak multipolarity? I mean, where are the weakest points in a free and open Indo-Pacific where states maybe aren't prepared to stand together? And I look at very much here at ASEAN and countries in ASEAN that maybe are not prepared to actually stand firm against a rising China. The reaction by some of the ASEAN states to AUKUS, I think, has been quite worrying, because it seems to be the case that they're gripping on to this non-aligned ASEAN centrality approach, which is all fine and good in a strategic environment where China isn't a real concern. But where you do have an obvious rising China that is clearly trying to impose its will, including through militarily controlling the South China Sea, I'm starting to think that ASEAN approach of centrality and non-alignment is becoming increasingly outdated.
With the hard power calculations that are being plotted out in various capitals right now, are you tracking the digital renminbi at all and the threat to the region?
I think that's a really interesting issue. I'm not per se, but I'm aware of it, obviously, and the potential for China to try and use that as an alternative trading currency to the US dollar, I think, is clearly in their minds. The question is, how do they pull that off? And I'm not an economist, so I probably can't really contribute in this regard, but I do think it's part of their grand strategy. The Chinese are very good thinkers at grand strategy. Everything is brought together in all the tools of statecraft, including finance and economy, and a digital renminbi, the ability to use Chinese currency to manage international trade, would give them huge power. So that's an interesting sort of question to follow in the future.
You've been a professor of strategic studies for some time, and obviously published at the highest levels. Is it just me, or is this a return to realpolitique? Is this a throwback to a different era with Mackinder, Mahan, and Hallschaffer reasserting themselves, or has this always been here and sort of we just decided to put it on the back foot for the past 20 years fighting the global war on terror?
I think it's very interesting to have considered, the sort of alternate history of what would have happened if 9/11 had never happened. If the terrorists had been foiled, or if they'd just not done it, where would we be now? Maybe China would be much further along, and we would have had that major war that we're thinking about now in the 2020s. But the reality is that Chinese military modernization only began in the late 1990s, and it's now only reaching that critical peak in terms of modernization of key capabilities. So it's highly likely that China would have, shall we say, bided its time and hided its strength for that 20-year period, and now it's coming to the fore. So maybe that counterfactual history wouldn't be that much different, apart from the fact that we wouldn't have spent so much blood and treasure and time sort of focused on the terrorism battle, and maybe we would have focused much more on the risk of great power conflict. So the US and its allies would be much better prepared for that. As it is now, we are in a race to try and make up for lost time that we've spent fighting terrorism, and refocus and realign our forces towards preparing for that major power war in the future.
You spoke about non-aligned nations that you see a clear line in the sand with how the coming years play out. I'm wondering if you speak towards the non-aligned nations in the Indo-Pacific that give you concern, but also with regards to Europe, traditional alliance structures like NATO. And if it's not too much, I'd like to tack on a third one. Is it just looking out on the horizon right now that New Zealand might not be getting the message with recent articulations on nuclear subs, but Canada as well with Huawei? Australia really seems to be stepping forward on the front foot and getting ahead of this. Is Five Eyes dead?
Look, I don't think Five Eyes is dead by any means. I do think New Zealand needs to take a good hard look at itself in terms of the role that it's playing in the region. Jacinda Ardern is internationally recognised as a leading thought leader and a political leader in many respects. But her statement the other day when AUKUS was announced to the effect that Australian submarines would not be welcome in New Zealand waters was unhelpful, to say the least. And I think it dates back to an anti-nuclear policy that was ill-conceived and ill thought out, and I think in many respects worked towards the achievement of our adversaries of the day, their objectives rather than the objectives of the Western alliance. And yet New Zealand still sticks to this anti-nuclear policy, which I find baffling. Particularly when her Jacinda Ardern's advisors must be telling her that naval nuclear reactor technology in the 2020s is much safer than it was back in the 1980s in terms of the way reactor technology has developed. So it's sort of like a dogmatic adherence to an outdated policy that needs to be reviewed. I think if she could make that leap, or if a New Zealand leader could make that leap and lift that anti-nuclear policy, that would be a very good thing. I think also New Zealand does need to recognise the risks of accommodating China in some of its foreign policy aspects. That worries me as well. So I don't think the Five Eyes are dead, but I do think that New Zealand is on the out in many respects. I do think there is a strong case, for example, to bring Japan in as another eye, and hopefully New Zealand would stay in the Five Eyes arrangements, but if it chose not to, then Japan would be a logical replacement for New Zealand. But I do think your broader point about the non-aligned states is an important one, because this contest, this strategic competition between China and the United States, or more broadly between Western liberal democracies and authoritarian states, because then you can include Russia with the European angle. This is just getting started. We're in a period now where it's going to last decades. The one issue where Metcalfe, for example, suggested that maybe China's power has peaked, I disagree with that. I think China has a long way to go before its power peaks. So we're in this strategic competition for decades. There's no guarantee we'll win it, but we do have to fight it. That means we need to build a coalition of like-minded democracies. And many of those democracies so far are non-aligned, which is a concern, because the alternative that they face is that by 2121, the world could be dominated by authoritarianism and democracy could be on the ash heap of history. And frankly, that's a pretty dark, dangerous future when you think about it. So that's where I think we do need to actually push non-aligned states to take another look and see what future do they want to be in. Do they want to be in a future where they pay tribute to a country like China in order to protect their own security and in the process become vassal states? Or do they want to work with democracies like Australia and the US and Britain and actually strengthen a free and open Indo-Pacific region which respects the rule of international law, respects equality of states, respects territorial boundaries and non-interference? And I think those are the fundamental choices.
And I'm wondering if you can touch on going back to the French and what that means for NATO, with the Indo-Pacific becoming the geostrategic pivot point of the future. What happens to NATO and that alliance structure?
Look, NATO is still critical because there is the Russian challenge. That's the other side of the coin. Although Russia is not nearly as strong in economic terms or technology terms as China is, it's still a huge threat in terms of its military capability and in particularly its nuclear capabilities. And the risk of a confrontation on NATO's eastern periphery, either over Ukraine or the Baltic states, I think is very real, or the Black Sea. So NATO still needs to be a key role, a key player for Europe, and the French need to play a role in it. And it would be farcical, to say the least, for the French to petulantly throw away their role in NATO over what's currently happening in regards to AUKUS. That would be a very, very much an own goal by the French. And it would certainly contribute towards weakening NATO and help Russia to achieve its goals of fragmenting NATO. So I do think it's vital that France recognize the long-term game here, recognize that there's always going to be other defense projects that they can work with Australia or with other countries. And really the big strategic issues are how Western liberal democracies, through organizations like NATO and through organizations like AUKUS and ANZUS and the Quad, work together to counterbalance and deter authoritarian states like China and Russia, and prevent that future that I pointed out of an authoritarian world in 2121, because I don't want to see that happen either.
It's unfortunate the way strategic studies sometimes works in policy making, but bureaucracies and politicians can typically only worry about one thing at a time. And we've gone from counterterrorism, nation building, counterinsurgency, and now we are returning to the realities that the globe is facing. However, it's pretty clear in Metcalfe's book that one of the largest issues that won't go away is energy and oil in the Middle East, no matter how bad we want to turn our backs to it. How does this feature within current calculations, particularly with regards to China and also Australia being completely reliant on those supply chains as well?
Yeah, that's a real problem. And, we're not going to have an alternative to oil for some time, even with the growing urgency of dealing with accelerating climate change. We've still got to rely on fossil fuels for some decades before we can make that transition out of that fossil fuel era. So the Middle East is still highly relevant. Our reliance on vulnerable supply chains of fossil fuels, of oil and natural gas are very risky, in the sense that we don't have the energy reserves that we do need to be able to survive, for example, a protracted war that could be fought. In the Middle East itself, the Middle East is obviously a region of highly unstable politics and conflict. I think the big concern on my part for the Middle East is the prospect that Iran will certainly break out of JCPOA, whether or not it comes back into effect. Iran will get nuclear weapons because the JCPOA, the way it's written, allows Iran to essentially build up all the capabilities needed for nuclear weapons within the agreement. And then when the agreement sunsets in the early 2030s, they can move very quickly to get nuclear weapons. So that's the big concern there, is that Iran ultimately gets nuclear weapons. Saudi gets nuclear weapons in response. Maybe Egypt and Turkey do as well. And you have that little proliferation cascade occurring in the Middle East, which makes the Middle East far more dangerous. But there's also the broader ongoing challenge, clearly, of jihadist Islamist terrorism and jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and so forth, that are going to still be there even after the withdrawal of Afghanistan. I mean, I know President Biden said, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda won't come back to Afghanistan, but frankly, that's nonsense, and I think everyone understands that. So, the Middle East is a region full of problems. Australia, whilst we're focusing very much on the Indo-Pacific as our primary focus, that link with the Middle East in terms of our energy security is important to manage, and we need to find a way to ultimately be less reliant on distant supplies of energy so that we don't have to focus so much on the Middle East. But nevertheless, events in the region are going to impact us, particularly if there's large-scale nuclear proliferation occurring across the Middle East region, which I worry is going to happen probably later in this decade.
Now, contacting you last week, I asked, your number one book recommendation. We've mentioned it a few times, and it's Roy Metcalf, I believe a colleague of yours down in Australia. You say you got a lot right. What did he get most wrong? Or not most wrong? That there's some nuance that you think should be applied to how he's looking at the current setup.
Well, I think that where he maybe overestimated the possibilities were for states such as the ASEAN states to actually promote the idea of an Indo-Pacific region. Listening to their debate, they don't seem to be talking about an Indo-Pacific so much as ASEAN. And I think there needs to be a broader dialogue between the ASEAN states, between Northeast Asia and obviously South Asia, an Indo-Pacific dialogue, if you like, as to defining what the Indo-Pacific really is and why it's important. So, whilst he's saying that an Indo-Pacific approach is an alternative approach to either submission to China or strategic contest between China and the United States, and that's his central argument. The center of that, which is, of course, ASEAN, is the weakest link. So how to get the ASEAN states to work with the rest of the region and actually make some key choices in terms of how they're going to move forward. I also felt that, he, as I said, he was probably overestimating or underestimating China's ability to sustain its development and its growth and its ability to sustain strategic competition with the West. It could be that China overtakes us in many respects. So we then have to maintain our interests and defend our interests from a position of inferiority in many respects. So what does that look like? And that's where I think really the Indo-Pacific region becomes even more important, because if the US is at a disadvantage across many indicators of state power, including potentially aspects of military power, then the US needs its allies in the region even more. And I think that's where AUKUS is really important. But I think also there needs to be enhanced dialogue through the Quad, and there needs to be enhanced dialogue with ASEAN. And it's ASEAN that is the challenge, getting them to get off the non-aligned fence and recognize that we need to work together if we want to have a free and open Indo-Pacific. Some ASEAN states may actually see their future as aligning with China. But what we want is ultimately an Indo-Pacific region that works together to promote a peaceful and stable, free and open Indo-Pacific as a counterbalance and an alternative to China's rise and things like the BRI and so forth. And there's that muddiness there in the picture that I think sort of is not at all clear. So I really liked Metcalf's book. I thought most of it was pretty good, but I was a little less convinced about ASEAN being a factor in that regard.
Okay. Is there any final points that you think?
Look, I think that the Indo-Pacific region is the crucial region, even more so than Europe in that sense, for many reasons. It's the heart of global economic activity. It's the center of technological change on the planet. It's clearly the core of probable military competition between the US and its allies against China, and with Taiwan being the most logical flashpoint for this decade. And that risk of a conflict over Taiwan is very real, and states, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but also more broadly, need to start thinking about how we prepare for that possibility. But Canada, for example, maybe needs to start talking with AUKUS and thinking about how Canada can play a role alongside the Quad and develop these multilateral frameworks that cross multiple organizations or multiple structures, rather than just having siloed structures such as AUKUS in one room, Quad in another, sort of NAFTA in another, and so forth. There needs to be a more complex multilateral dialogue in that regard. So I think it's a fascinating area to be in and to work in, and things are moving very fast. And so the very fact that AUKUS caught everyone by surprise, the way it did, but has had such a huge disruptive impact on the region, I think is highly significant. It's one of these black swan moments that you simply don't see coming along, but it has a huge lasting impact, and we're now all trying to respond to that. So it's a good time to be a strategic analyst in Australia, that's for sure.
And also congratulations with the announcement of ASPI opening in Washington, DC. I'm sure
it's a great move. We knew about it back in November that it was happening, like November last year, but it's been sort of moving very slowly ever since then. And so we've now got the formal announcement. So yes, it's going to be a great opportunity, and obviously I'm hoping to get over there and spend a bit of time over there myself at some point. But there's opportunities, I think, elsewhere for ASPI as well. I think an office in Tokyo would be a good move, and maybe one in London, who knows, but we'll see.
Okay. I asked you to give me one book recommendation, contemporary, last week, and thank you for that. I'd now ask, historically, should we be reviewing Bismarck, the interwar period? What's the best lens to look at this current period historically?
The Guns of August, I think.
Tuckman.
The lead up to the First World War, because people debate, is the current strategic environment more like the period leading up to the First World War, in which case the Guns of August is clearly one, or the Second World War, where you have an aggressive rising power. I think right at the moment it's more like the Guns of August and the lead up to the First World War, where you have major powers all competing, but the potential exists for a crisis to emerge which forces them all into conflict. And so I think the Guns of August would be a good read in terms of understanding what are the dynamics of conflict, of states blundering into a major power war. And I think that's the real crisis.
That sounds like a great place to leave it. Dr. Davis, I could talk to you for hours, but I know you're a very busy man. You've got other things to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great.